Thank you, Harriet, and to the panel for that discussion. Conference, we meet here in Manchester, 2 years on from our leadership election, a contest held in the shadow of a general election defeat. And we all know what's supposed to happen when political parties lose elections. Acrimony, division, the party turning in on itself, out of touch with the views of the country. Well, Conference, 2 years on, in this generation, we have bucked that trend. I can't remember our party ever being so united, so determined to win back the trust of the people again, with our economy in recession and the unfairness of this Tory-led coalition now laid bare. Let us show we are the people to rebuild Britain strong and fair for the future. And Conference, making the case for change, setting the agenda on reform of our media, our banks, responsibility in our economy from top to bottom, showing the strength of purpose and moral conviction which won him the job and will get him to Downing Street. Let us pay tribute to my friend, our leader, the next Prime Minister of our country, Ed Miliband. You know, I am proud to serve in Ed's shadow cabinet, now with more than 40% women, the first time that has ever happened in British politics. And what a contrast to David Cameron's cabinet, where the men get the jobs, the women get the sack, and only the chaps get the knighthoods. Let me ask you this. What does it take to get sacked from David Cameron's cabinet? Swear at a police officer, call him a pleb. You get defended to the hilt. Get caught red-handed, texting market-sensitive information to News International, you get promoted. Flatline the economy, deliver the most shambolic, unfair budget in living memory, and you stay in post. More than that, you're allowed to stay part-time. Do all of those things, and David Cameron will let you keep your job. But not if you're a woman. What kind of Prime Minister thinks it's fair to sack a 54-year-old woman in his cabinet because she's too old, and then give the job to a 56-year-old man instead? Let me tell you, a Prime Minister who only appoints 5 women in the first place, sacks 3 of them, demotes the other 2, and then attacks the Labour leadership for not being butch enough. Butch. Whatever did he mean? If David Cameron's butch, where does that leave George Osborne? Perhaps this is why George Osborne will never be sacked. A Prime Minister and a Chancellor going down fighting together, and this time let's see them ride off into the sunset, Butch Cameron and the Flatline Kid. And Conference, doesn't it feel good to be back in Manchester? Or should I say to be back in Labour Manchester? 4 Labour MPs, 3 world-class universities, 2 world-beating football teams, 1 Labour council, and not a single Tory councillor in the whole city, not a single one. And let us pledge today to keep it that way and elect the brilliant Lucy Powell as Manchester's first ever Labour woman MP. And let me say too, I can think of no one better to be Manchester's first ever Police and Crime Commissioner than the wise and highly respected Tony Lloyd. And conference, at a time of such tragedy for policing in this city, our whole country remembers two brave officers who lost their lives doing their duty. And we pay tribute to all those public servants up and down the country, police officers, firefighters, our armed forces, who every day put their lives on the line to keep us safe. And conference, as we rightly praise the success of London 2012, let's not forget it was Manchester's hosting of the 2002 Commonwealth Games which showed the way and proved that Britain was ready to stage the biggest international sporting events. And conference, we salute Graham Stringer and Sir Richard Lees and all those who made it possible. We salute those people who brought the Olympics to London and made that such a success. Tony Blair, Prince William, Ken Livingstone, Gordon Brown, Lord Coe, Boris Johnson, too many others to mention. But let us remember that none of them would have been able to play their part if not for the one person who made it all possible. Conference, please join me in thanking Dame Tessa Jow. Conference, it was Tessa's officials who told her it would be a disaster to host the 2012 Games. It would cost too much, the stadiums wouldn't be ready, London's transport couldn't cope, the security would be a nightmare. Tessa could have listened to all those concerns, but she didn't. She persevered, we won the bid, and the rest is now part of our national history. And there is a lesson we should learn from this. With wise leadership, long-term vision, and a strong partnership between government and citizens, between business, trade unions, and the voluntary sector, we can do great things. We can lead the rest of the world. We can rebuild Britain for the future. But if you listen to the doubters, if you never take a risk, if you flinch when obstacles are in the way, you will never get anything done. And if you spend your whole time fighting short-term political battles, Dave versus Boris, Boris versus George, George versus Vince, you will never rise to the long-term needs of the country, and in the end, you let people down and you lose their trust. And nowhere is that more obvious than in our economy today. Thank goodness the Olympics has given us a short-term shot in the arm that might just be enough to take us out of recession this quarter. But that is no substitute for a long-term strategy. Not when families are struggling to make ends meet, not when food and fuel prices are going up, but wages are frozen and tax credits cut, not when so many young people have been unable to find work or to stay on in education, not when so many small businesses are struggling to raise the finance that they need to survive until the year end, not when so many working people in the private and public sectors are worried about their jobs and their pensions, the human cost of this government's economic failure. Remember what David Cameron and George Osborne and Nick Clegg promised 2 years ago. Tax rises faster, deeper spending cuts faster would secure the recovery and make Britain a safe haven. That theirs was the only credible plan to deal with the deficit, and that we were all in this together. Conference, the recovery secured. We are just one of only 2 G20 countries in recession, the longest double-dip recession since the Second World War. A credible plan to deal with our deficits. Because we're in recession, the deficit is now not going down, the deficit is going up by 22% so far this year. Rising borrowing not to invest in the jobs of the future, but to pay for the mounting costs of this government's economic failure. Conference, there is nothing credible about a plan that leads to a double-dip recession, to thousands of businesses going bust, to 1 million young people out of work, to billions wasted on a soaring benefits bill, to borrowing going up, not down. That's not credible. That is just plain wrong. And as for we're all in this together, we don't hear that line anymore. Not from a chancellor who presented the most unfair and unpopular budget in a generation. A chancellor who tried to raise taxes on pasties, caravans, churches and charities, but who refused to look seriously at proposals for a mansion tax. A chancellor who in 6 months' time will raise taxes for pensioners on the very same day he cuts the top rate of tax for the very richest, a £3 billion tax cut, giving £40,000 a year to a millionaire. £40,000 a year. Conference, what kind of government asks pensioners to pay for a tax cut for millionaires? What kind of government believes low-paid women will only work harder if you take away their tax credits and make them worse off, but millionaires will only work harder if you give them a tax cut to make them better off? Conference, isn't this the truth? We know what kind of government this is. Failing on the economy, failing on the deficit, hitting the many to help a privileged few, arrogant, complacent, and out of touch. It's the same old Tory government. That's what it is. David Cameron, George Osborne, Nick Clegg, the same old Tories, every one of them. But you know what the worst thing is? For 2 years, they've told us all this pain will be worth it in the end, that it will be short-term pain for long-term gain. But what we are now seeing is short-term pain doing long-term damage in our economy. Look at the facts. Over 33,000 companies gone bust since the general election. Investment plans cancelled or diverted overseas. Our economy weaker, capacity lost, more prone to inflationary pressures when the recovery finally comes, child poverty rising, long-term youth unemployment becoming entrenched, damaging them for the rest of their lives. And Conference, if we carry on like this, a divided coalition, muddling through, no vision, waiting for something to turn up, the danger is that 2 lost years become 3 and 4, and we slip into a lost decade of slow growth, of high unemployment and stagnation. Lost investment, lost output, lost jobs, lost exports, lost tax revenues, a decade when we failed to make the investments and the reforms we need to make our economy stronger and fairer for the future. And it does not have to be this way. While we've been stalled, other countries have been moving forward. Last year, private investment in Germany rose by 7%. 1 million extra students enrolled in university in America. China is building 80,000 miles of roads a year and is now planning 70 new airports. And here in Britain, private investment down 2%. More students, no, over 50,000 fewer. And not one of the road projects David Cameron announced last year has even started in construction. And when you look at this picture of stagnation and inaction, is it any wonder the deficit is now going up? We warned 2 years ago that drastic spending cuts and early tax rises too far, too fast, risk choking off the recovery and making a difficult situation worse. We warned you either learn the lessons of history or you repeat the mistakes of history. Because this is the fundamental truth. If more people are on the dole not paying tax, you can't get the deficit down. If businesses are going bust not hiring new workers, you can't get the deficit down. If the economy is not growing, you can't get the deficit down. And that is why we must act now to kickstart the recovery, to tackle the causes of that rising borrowing, to make our economy stronger for the future. A year ago in Liverpool, we set out 5 actions the government should take then and now to boost growth, tax bank bonuses, and use the money to create jobs for 100,000 young people and 25,000 more social homes. Genuinely bring forward long-term investment in our infrastructure. Temporarily reverse the damaging VAT rise. Give every small firm taking on extra workers a 1-year national insurance tax break. Cut VAT to 5% for a year on home improvements. But conference, since last year, David Cameron's government has done next to nothing. Their economic plan is failing and they don't know what to do. Plan A, Plan B, Plan A plus. With this government, I don't see any plan at all. And that is why it is now so urgent we kickstart the recovery. We must go further and we must act now. With 119,000 construction jobs lost in 2 years, a 68% fall in the number of affordable homes being built, we need bold and urgent action now. So with Hilary Benn and Jack Dromey, this is what we propose. The government is anticipating a windfall of up to £4 billion from the sale of the 4G mobile phone spectrum. In good times, Labour used every penny of the £22 billion from the sale of the 3G licences to repay national debt. But in difficult times, we urgently need to put something back into our economy. So with this one-off windfall from the sale of the 4G spectrum, let's cut through this government's dither and rhetoric and actually do something. Not more talk, but action now. Let's use the money from the 4G sale and build over the next 2 years 100,000 new homes, affordable homes to rent and buy, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs. Let's get our construction industry moving again. And add to that a stamp duty holiday for first-time buyers. We can deliver real help for people aspiring to get onto the property ladder. Conference, this is a clear and costed plan to kickstart the recovery and get people back to work, building the homes we need now and for the long term, building our way out of recession and rebuilding Britain for the future. And we also need reform to boost long-term investment in skills, the only route to rising living standards for working people. Chuka's right to say we need a modern industrial policy to support long-term wealth creation with strategic support for our advanced manufacturing and service industries. We need to work and campaign together to tackle tax avoidance and bogus self-employment and prevent a race to the bottom through regional pay. We need to enforce the minimum wage. We need to help parents balance work and family life and make sure our labour market is genuinely flexible and fair for working people. And let's go further and promote the living wage too. And we also know our banking system needs cultural change and radical reform. Reform which this government is only interested in watering down. That is why Ed Miliband and I are clear. We do need a full and open, independent public inquiry into the culture and practices of the banking industry. We do need radical reform to separate retail and investment banking. We need active support for mutuals and cooperatives. We need a continued campaign for an international transactions tax and a proper business investment bank, this one properly backed by the Treasury. And conference, let me also say this about the hundreds of thousands of working people earning ordinary salaries who work hard every day behind the counters of our high street banks. They were shocked and dismayed at everyone else, at the gross irresponsibility and greed of a few millionaire bankers at the top who caused such damage and gave their industry a bad name. Working people who want tougher regulation, who want banks to work for the long-term interests of our economy and who do not deserve to be pilloried for their hard work and service. At conference, the financial crisis did expose deep-rooted problems in our economy. After the global financial crisis, it was always going to be difficult to get the deficit down. Even if we do get our economy growing again, even if we do reform our banking system, we are going to face tough choices in the years ahead. But the longer this government staggers on with a failing economic plan, the worse it will be and the harder it will get. Hard times are going to last longer than any of us hoped, and we can't promise to put everything right straight away, which is why, however difficult this is, when we don't know what we will inherit, we can't make any commitments now that the Labour government will be able to reverse particular tax rises or spending cuts, because unlike Nick Clegg, we will not make promises we cannot keep. Of course, we'll make different choices. We'll do things in a fairer and more balanced way and put jobs and growth first. But conference, as I said to the TUC, we have to be upfront with the British people that under Labour there would have been cuts, and that on spending, pay and pensions there will be difficult decisions in the future from which we won't flinch. Before the next election, when we know the circumstances we face, we will set out for our manifesto tough new fiscal rules to get our country's current budget back to balance and national debt on a downward path. Not a meaningless fiscal rule like George Osborne's, a promise to balance the book in 5 years' time, with that 5-year period moving forward every year after year. Conference, our fiscal rules will be monitored independently by the Office for Budget Responsibility. We will take the action required to meet them. When we sell off the government shares in the banks, every penny will go to the national debt. Conference, that is what we mean by fiscal responsibility in the national interest. And because we all know there can't be a post-election spending spree, in our first year in government, we'll hold a zero-based spending review to look at every pound spent by government, carefully looking at what the government can and cannot afford, rooting out waste, boosting productivity, building on the work that Rachel Reeves and John Trickett are leading. But we will do things differently to this government. Not slashing budgets without a care in the world, damaging the economy, but also hitting women harder than men. Instead, we will assess every pound of taxpayers' money, including for its impact on growth and fairness. Not opting for short-term cuts that look easy, but which end up costing more in the long term, like deep cuts to youth services, to adult mental health services, and to public health. And not ducking the hard long-term issues we know we haven't properly faced up to yet as a country. Issues which transcend parties and parliaments, where we badly need a cross-party consensus. So let us finally get a long-term plan to support the most vulnerable in our society, look after children and adults needing social care. The conference, this is not just about policy. It's about the kind of country we want to be and the way we do our politics. Where we face important long-term challenges, we must seek a consensus that puts short-term politics aside and puts the national interest first, just as we did over a decade ago when we made the Bank of England independent. And nowhere is such a consensus more essential than on our national infrastructure. The lesson of the Olympics is that if we approach major long-term infrastructure projects in a long-term way and build a cross-party sense of national purpose, we can deliver. And yet, it took 13 years after the opening of the Channel Tunnel to complete the high-speed train link to London. Crossrail was delayed for years and years, for decades. And why is it so often the case in our country? Yes, our cumbersome planning system. Yes, proper and legitimate concerns for the environment. Too often in the past, governments have assumed vital infrastructure can only be funded by public investment and then balked at the bill. But above all, successive governments, including our own, have ducked or delayed vital decisions on our national infrastructure, sometimes allowed politics to come first. Just look at this government in the last few months. Will Boris or Dave win on Heathrow? Will Conservative MPs block high-speed rail? Will George see Zach off on renewable energy? What a ridiculous way to run a country. No wonder business is fast losing confidence in this government's ability to make long-term decisions. But this is not just a problem of this government, and we have to be the party to break that cycle. Because if we don't, if we put off major decisions for another generation, it will be our children and grandchildren who will pay the consequences. Let me give you a few examples. We must decide how and when we're going to deliver super-fast broadband across the whole of the UK and avoid a two-tier Britain. We must decide whether we need to replace our antiquated national grid or risk more power cuts in the future. We must decide as a country on a clear plan to invest in nuclear power, wind and tidal power and other renewables so we can lead the world in delivering clean, decarbonised energy and green jobs. We must decide how we're going to protect our country from rising sea levels and exceptional rainfall, including whether we need to replace or reinforce the Thames barrier to prevent London from flooding. And we must decide, alongside vital decisions on rail and airport capacity, how we're going to get more freight off our roads and onto railways. It won't help our grandchildren if they're all driving electric cars, but they're still in gridlock on the M6 or the M25. On all these issues, if we don't start to plan now, what will we say in 30 years' time when our children ask, why didn't you act when there was still time? And that is why we need a comprehensive long-term plan to rebuild Britain's infrastructure for the 21st century and a cross-party consensus to deliver it. And it is why, too, when government budgets are tight, we must think innovatively about how we can finance these vital projects in the coming decades, drawing on the private sector and long-term pension savings. So Ed Miliband and I have asked the chair of the Olympic Delivery Authority, Sir John Armitt, to consider how long-term infrastructure decision-making, planning, delivery and finance can be radically improved over the coming decades. And I can announce today that Sir John has agreed to lead this work and to draw up plans for a commission or process independent of government that can assess and make proposals on the long-term infrastructure needs of our country over the coming days and decades and help build that consensus. Not repeating the mistakes of the past, but learning from them. Building a consensus which crosses party lines without chopping and changing one parliament to the next. This is what we mean by building a consensus to rebuild Britain for the future. And conference, there is another lesson we must learn from our history. Many people have said over recent weeks, this has been Britain's greatest ever summer. But let me remind you of an even greater summer still. The summer of 1945, the end of 6 hard years of war, when our nation welcomed its heroes home from the battlefields of Europe, Asia and America and celebrated together the defeat of fascism. Conference, our predecessors were elected that year to rebuild a country ravaged by conflict. They faced even greater challenges than we face today. An economy enfeebled by war, a national debt double the size of ours today. And they made tough and unpopular decisions to continue with rationing, to cut defence spending, and to introduce prescription charges. But that Labour cabinet also remained focused on the long-term task ahead, and they learned from history, and they rejected the failed austerity of the 1930s. And that meant conference. That meant they could put in place long-term reforms, enduring achievements vital to our country's future. The Beveridge Report, new homes for heroes, the school leaving age raised, and for the first time ever, a national health service, free to all, based on need, not ability to pay, over 60 years later, celebrated in our Olympics opening ceremony for all the world to see, still today, the greatest health service in all the world. Conference. They were very different times. But it is our task to recapture the spirit and values and sense of national purpose of that time. Just think of the people in whose footsteps we now follow. Working men and women who in the years before had seen a hardship that many of us will never experience. But their suffering did not teach them selfishness. It taught them solidarity. And that is why they never settled for second best in their battle for education for all, for free healthcare, and for proper rights at work. And Conference, we owe it to them. But more than that, we owe it to our children and their children to come to learn from that example, to make the tough decisions, but not to sacrifice their futures. Because when our grandchildren look back at us, what will they say? Will they say we cast a generation of young people on the scrap heap of unemployment? Will they say we, as a generation, dismantled the NHS and made it harder to go to university? Will they say we plunged Britain into a decade of economic stagnation while other countries raced ahead? Will they say we left Britain less prosperous, more unequal, more unfair? Or will they say, even as we made tough and painful decisions, that ours was the generation that got a record number of young people into apprenticeships and into university? Ours was the generation that safeguarded the NHS and started the rebuilding of our national infrastructure. Ours was the generation that tackled our debts by growing and reforming our economy and making sure the banking crisis that caused those debts could never happen again. That ours was the generation that broke from the cycle of political short-termism and started to rebuild Britain anew in the long-term interest. Let us go forward, not flinching from tough decisions, giving our young people hope, rebuilding Britain for the future. That is our challenge. That is our mission. Let us go forward and do it together. Thank you.